When you were a child, back in the pre-television era, your parents took you to a travelling tent show called Sawley's. And it is actually sorely missed, the kind of experiences that it offered. And I thought we might start off by talking about Sawley's.
Yes, it was late 50s. I was about 7 or 8 in 58 and 59. And as far as I know, they were kind of the touring vaudeville variety ensemble that their target was mostly northern New South Wales and Queensland. And they would have been, I suppose, the equivalent of the big Tivoli circuit or whatever in the cities.
But just playing the regional areas.
Yeah, and, you know, by my memory, the tent was huge. And I've just read recently, and I'm not sure whether this was the original version of it, because George Sawley created this company back in the 30s during the Depression. He would have died sometime after that. And then Grace Sawley, his wife, and Bobby LeBrun, who was a very well-known Newcastle comedian, decided to revive it in the 50s. And it survived, I think, up until about 1962. And I am aware that I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago in regards to some historical detail, and I wanted to invite Val Gillay, who performed, as did Maury Fields, I know, in that period. But at the entrance to the exhibition, when I was talking it over with the designer, Anna Cordingley, who's a girl, not an adverb, I said, look, I really want the entrance to the exhibition to be a recreation of this photo. And long before I knew there was going to be an exhibition, I'd done some Googling on Sawley's to sort of piece the story together a bit more. And a wonderful photographer called Jeff Carter had taken a series of about 8 shots of the entrance and the tent being erected and people backstage, etc., or people sitting in their caravan that they would have travelled around in. And I then found out that he had died a couple of years ago, but the photo was really, really quite artful. And then, by sheer coincidence, Robert McFarlane, who's a very notable theatre photographer, he'd been helping me out because he made generous gifts of silver gelatin prints of some of the productions that I'd been in. And he said, oh no, I knew Jeff Carter. He was an amazing guy. He was sort of like an Ernest Hemingway kind of guy. I think he would go and shoot very documentary. He would only shoot people in the country, farmers at work, etc., etc. And by good fortune, he happens to have left us with the only, you know, serious archival material about the Sawley's era.
So what was it exactly about Sawley's that really excited you?
It was the canvas. Yep. You know, you went into this giant tent. They had a proscenium arch stage down at one end, but no fly tower, so all the curtains would ruche when they rose, you know what I mean? And by night, I think they would do a rather burlesque variety show with sight acts. Bobby LeBrun was probably a bit bluer at night than he might have been as the panto dame in the afternoons. And some of those acts, like the ventriloquist, as you mentioned, there was one guy that I thought was just brilliant. I found the theatre of seeing a man playing a woman, the duality of that I found really curious and fascinating, because his character as Dame Trot in Jack and the Beanstalk was probably about the age of my grandmother. And I thought, well, I know my granny and I love her, but this guy's falling over and getting pies in the face and stuff like that, you know. But the ventriloquist really thrilled me because he had a moment. They would weave his act from the nighttime show into the pantomime in the daytime for whatever reason. And at one of the shows I saw, he got 2 kids up out of the audience and he just said to them, now look, when I press your rib here, I just want you to go That's not very good for radio, I know. Opens mouth, closes mouth. And then he sang a song, and they looked as though they were singing it. Do you know what I mean? And there was just something kind of, I found really thrilling about that kind of performance.
You grew up in, was it Toowoomba?
It's in Toowoomba, up in the Darling Downs.
Well, that was like a traditional trail, wasn't it, for an Australian actor? At some point, you'd have to go back to the old country, either the UK or try your luck in the USA. But you were more of a Europhile?
Yes, Italophile, Slavophile. I've been talking about that with Giuseppe a lot because, again, in that period when I started out, when I was 20, I think, when I started professionally, and in various question and answers we've had with the release of The Best Offer, we were completely influenced and swamped by a real golden age of Italian cinema. You can, with Visconti, De Sica, Fellini, Bertolucci, Antonioni. I mean, the list was huge, and a very diverse portrait of Italian culture. So it was a bit of a dream come true for me to be offered a role in a Tornatore film, because I think he comes very much from the branches of that family tree.
Shine was a breakthrough film, not only for yourself but also for the director Scott Hicks and writer Jan Sardi. But that was a film, as a project, it was tantalising out of reach, wasn't it, for several years? It far from happened overnight.
Scott, I think, had seen David perform in 1986 in Adelaide at the, might have been during a music festival or something like that, and he instantly felt that he wanted to try and make a film of this story. And he befriended David and Gillian and spent many, many years working with them and recording David's story and so forth. I eventually got to read the screenplay in 1992, and Jan had really sculpted quite what you would call a good read. It was a page-turner, You could imagine what the tone of the film was going to be like. And then every 3 months I would get a phone call. They would say, the financing is not quite in place yet, but hold on, And that happened right up until 1995. And eventually they did get some money together. And I think the story goes that one of the financiers from Pandora, which is a European outfit, had seen me in a Belvoir production of Hamlet, playing Horatio, the bridesmaid's role, and I think that tipped the balance. They put in the amount of money that needed to top up the budget.
Pirates of the Caribbean, I assume you had no idea that was going to turn into the franchise it became, but also I imagine that must have been, who would have thought, a swashbuckler movie? When did that genre die out?
There's a bit of a story behind that. I'd committed with my long-time collaborator, the director, Neil Armfield. We've probably done about 17 or 20 productions together since 1980. And we had committed and earmarked to do Waiting for Godot at Belvoir Theatre in 2003. Then my LA agent phoned me and said, Jerry Bruckheimer's offering you this role. And I got a great letter from Gore Verbinski, the director, great cover letter, read the script and found that Ted Elliott, Terry Rossio, who had written the first Shrek, which I thought was a very smart piece of mainstream commercial writing, and they'd also written The Mask of Zorro, which I thought had good Saturday matinee qualities to it. But I wrote my agent, Fred Spector, maybe a 4-page A4 lengthy email as to why I would unfortunately have to turn it down because I'd committed to do this play. And then I got a phone call from him the next morning. It was now you listen to me. he said, Jerry Bruckheimer is a great producer, and this role will give you, it was financially a little stronger than normally the smaller independent films. But he said this will broaden your range in the eyes of producers and directors and so forth. And so eventually, I decided to do that and not do Waiting for Godot, which was a hard letter then to write to Belvoir to say, I'm not going to do the Beckett. I'm going off to do a pirate movie. It's like I might as well just have spat in their faces, you know. But, you know, at the time, there was a lot of negative press because people were going, oh, my God, Hollywood's really going down the toilet. They're now basing films on theme park rides. But, and there were certain, I thought, rather beautiful homages to elements of the ride itself. But Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, oh, yeah, great, subtle. They are great historical researchers, you know, and the golden age of piracy was very much in a European imperial era, maybe mid-1600s, and it was probably all over by about 1720. And it's because the Catholic and the Protestant nations of Europe, they kind of condoned and allowed for pirates and privateers to rob each other, because it was a great way to trounce the Spanish Catholics or whatever. Yeah. You know what I mean? No one was very cocky because there hadn't been a successful pirate film, I don't think, since the Burt Lancaster one was The Crimson Pirate back in '51. You know, Roman Polanski had made a pirate film. I think Cutthroat Island had been a huge box office disaster. But Jerry, as a producer, he would send the script back, I've been told, many times, until they came up with the hook that there was a curse. He suddenly found that a slightly more interesting angle, rather than just a lot of swashbuckling, you know.
Did Geoffrey, in the short time we've got left, we might take some audience questions.
Yes, hi, Geoffrey. My name's Thomas, and just wanted to ask you a question regarding Shine. You were talking about the physicality that certainly helped you get the role and learn the role of David Helfgott. But I'm curious to know, I'm always keen about pianists portrayed in film, and I'm wondering if you learned piano for that role.
I learned to look as though I could play the piano. I had played as a child from about the age of 9 till about 15, till the time I started running the school drama club. It was a very pivotal point in my life now that I look back on it. I won't need therapy. But so I knew, not really a classical repertoire. I think there was a little bit of Strauss waltzes and there was Alley Cat and things like that. And then I gave up piano at 15. So this was 30 years later, and the role was there. So I knew how to very slowly read music. I worked with a piano tutor and said to Scott, the director, you know, I really have to, if you're going to be Hamlet, you've got to learn how to sword fight really fantastically for that Act 5 finale to work. And I said, in film, I know you can fake, you can shoot over the keyboard, you can put the keyboard just out of frame or whatever, but I said, I really, like things like The Flight of the Bumblebee, I want it to look absolutely perfect. So I worked with a tutor for about 4 months, and I learnt to mime to David Helfgott's special recordings of the chosen bits of music. And I said, as long as there are some shots where my hands, my elbows, my shoulder and my head and the keyboard are all in the frame, I think it will work well. And I would rehearse with a blanket stuffed down into the upright piano at home because the racket I was making was just like appalling. Probably not good for my marriage, not good for the neighbours, you know. And with this tutor, we worked out, we had a colour system. If I could play 20 bars really good with everything showing, we called that the red shot. And I'd say to Scott Hicks, I can give you a red shot on this one. And then I'd say, in this bit, in the Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, you have got to be a concert pianist to play it. That's when you cut away to people at the bar saying, he's really good, isn't he? You know.